Read our lesson from the book of Isaiah, chapter 40. And there Isaiah writes, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all of her sins. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. And a voice says, cry out. And I said, what shall I cry? All people are like grass, and all of their faithfulness is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall because the breath of the Lord blows on them. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God endures forever. You who bring good news to Zion, go up on a high mountain. You who bring good news to Jerusalem, lift up your voice with a shout. Lift it up. Do not be afraid. Say to the towns of Judah, here is your God. See, the sovereign Lord comes with power, and he rules with a mighty arm. See, his reward comes with power, and it is with him, and his recompense accompanies him. He tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms, and he carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that have young. Well, there was a certain man. He worked in the post office. It was the Christmas season, and it was this man's job to process all of the mail that had illegible addresses. Well, one day he had a letter that crossed his desk. It was addressed in some rather shaky handwriting to God. And it being his job, he thought he better open up the letter and find out a little bit more about where it needed to be sent. And this is what he read. Dear God, I'm a 93-year-old widow. I live on a very small pension. And yesterday someone stole my purse. It had $100 in it, which was all the money I had until my next pension check. Next Sunday is Christmas, and I've invited 2 friends over for dinner, and without that money, I have nothing to buy food with. I have no family to turn to. You are my only hope. Can you please help me? Sincerely, Edna. Well, the postal worker was touched, and so he showed the letter to his co-workers, and each of them, they dug into their pockets, and they came up with a few dollars apiece, which meant that by the time that he made the rounds, that he had $96, which he put into an envelope, and then he sent it to this woman. And the rest of the day, all the postal workers, they had this kind of warm glow in their hearts because of the kind deed they had done. And Christmas came. And then it went, and a few days after Christmas, yet another letter came from 93-year-old Edna. Again, it was addressed to God, and so all the workers gathered around. They wanted to read the letter as it was opened, and this is what it said. Dear God, I can't thank you enough for what you did for me. Because of your gift of love, I was able to have this glorious Christmas feast for my friends. We had such a good time. And I told my friends about a wondrous gift. By the way, there was $4 missing. I think it must have been those thieves down at the post office. Sincerely, Edna. As I quoted from Robert Burns last week, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry, don't they? Well, at least it's the thought that counts. And that brings us to this beautiful passage that we just heard for today from Isaiah 40. Let's hear just a little bit of it again. Comfort, comfort ye my people, says your God. You who bring good news to Zion, go up on a high mountain. You who bring good news to Jerusalem, lift up your voice with a shout. Lift it up. Do not be afraid to say to the towns of Judah, here is your God. What powerfully relevant words for us here on the second Sunday of Advent. Comfort ye my people. And what was the occasion of Isaiah's words of comfort to his people, the Israelites? Was, you may recall, from a number of months ago, as we were making our way through the story, God's people, Israel, they had this civil war, and they split into two kingdoms, Israel to the north and Judah to the south. And then in 722 BC, as a result of the northern kingdom's wickedness down there in the lower story, and despite all of the repeated warnings from God's prophets, as they uttered this from the upper story, what we learned was that God allowed for this mighty nation of Assyria to come along, defeat Israel, to port them away back to Assyria, and suddenly, poof, Israel, the northern kingdom, ceased to exist. They're now gone forever. In fact, history refers to this people who were carted off as being the lost tribes of Israel. Well, meanwhile, to the south, little Judah, she carries on. And every once in a while, she'll have a good king, a king like Hezekiah or Josiah. But we learn that more often than not, Judah is following the same path of destruction as her sister to the north, Israel. And to sort of contextualize for you folks, Isaiah has been prophesying to his people in Judah down south in that same 8th century BC that they're to turn from their wicked ways because they're facing the same mighty Assyria, just like their Israelite neighbors to the north were, but to no avail. So finally in chapter 39 of Isaiah, he's given this sad news from God that it's time to tell Judah that their time is coming, that they will be sent off into exile. Okay. But wait a minute, Pastor. I remember from our journey through the story that Israel, yeah, they were carted off in 722 BC, but that Judah wasn't carried off into exile by another nation, not the Assyrians, but the Babylonians, until 135 years later in 586 BC. And that's the 6th century BC, not the 8th century in 722. So either Isaiah has lived an awfully long life, or something else is going on here. Because old Isaiah, he prophesies in chapter 39 about Judah's exile, and then just one chapter further on, now it's over a century later, and Isaiah is speaking to God's people now in exile in Babylon. So what gives here, preach? Well, perhaps you've been exposed to a particular way of viewing the book of Isaiah. Maybe it was in your college intro to the Old Testament class. Maybe it was on the Discovery Channel or somewhere else. But scholars claim that there is more than one author behind this book. You know, they say that beginning here in chapter 40, what we're reading is not the work of Isaiah, but of some anonymous prophet living during the Babylonian exile over a century later. They call him second Isaiah. And some even propose with chapters 56 through 66 that we're reading yet another still later anonymous prophet called third Isaiah. Now, why would anyone come up with this idea of multiple authors for a book? Perhaps because dividing the books of the Old Testament into many hands, written over many centuries, has become this sort of established tradition in academic circles. And sure, in the book of Isaiah, we do see the style and the tone change along the way. There's this definite shift if you were to read chapter 39, the chapter before we read for today, and then you were to read chapter 40, because the scene has shifted from Judah in chapter 39, facing the Assyrians in the 8th century, to now in chapter 40, the exiles in Babylon in the 6th century BC. And yet, let me tell you that not all biblical scholars agree that we should break this book down into multiple authors that are spread across the centuries. And why? Well, first, because the Bible itself identifies one author for this book. Chapter 1, verse 1 of the book of Isaiah reads, "The vision of Isaiah, the son of Amoz." And besides, the New Testament, it refers to passages from Isaiah again and again as the word of the prophet Isaiah. And if we accept the testimony of Jesus and of the apostles on other matters, then why would we reject their word on this? And besides as well, folks, I've been to the shrine of the book. I've been to that museum in Jerusalem which houses the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of history's greatest archaeological finds, including the crown jewel of the whole collection, the 24-foot-long Great Isaiah Scroll. And I can tell you for certain that chapter 39 flows into chapter 40 as a seamless unity. There is no partition book of Isaiah found there. And folks, I could say a lot more about this, but let it be enough for now that many like myself, we accept that Isaiah saw prophetically beyond his own day, so that in chapter 40 and beyond, he could speak into a later historical perspective that once again, in chapter 39, Isaiah predicts that Judah would one day go into exile in Babylon, and they did, in 586 BC, just over a century later. So King Nebuchadnezzar and all of his Babylonian armies, they come along and they sack Jerusalem, they destroy the temple, and 10,000 of Israel's brightest and best are marched off to Babylon in what is today known as modern-day Iraq. And many of the rest that are left behind are in prison. Yeah, this was a far cry from what God had wanted for his people. He had said that from Abraham would come a great nation that would bless the whole world. But then God's people failed to live up to that calling, and as a result, they now paid for it heavily. They're in exile. They're far away from home, and their beloved Jerusalem and its temple is lying in ruins. And naturally, in the course of time, these exiles, they do marry and they build houses and they have children and they settle in this new land. After all, they might as well make Babylon their home, right? And the prophet Jeremiah, he did tell them that they were going to be there for 70 years. So they do the best they can with their new surroundings. And yet still, there was this longing. There was this mourning for what had been. Yeah, God's people, they feel bitter and defeated and disillusioned. In fact, they feel like God has failed them, even though they have no one to blame for their present plight but themselves. And yet, isn't that what we typically do in situations like that? Sure, we blame God. And for his part, how did God respond? Well, it's within this context that Isaiah prophesies some much needed words of grace. He says, comfort ye, my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sins have been paid for. And undoubtedly, many of you will be exposed in the next few weeks, I'm sure, to one of the great works of this season. It's called the Messiah. In fact, if you know the history behind this work, it seems that in the summer of 1741, that over the course of 24 days, that a man named George Friedrich Handel composed the music for the Messiah. And then later on, the words, they were added in by a guy named Charles Jennens. But here's what's important. The first words, as you listen during this season to the Messiah, are taken directly from today's passage, from Isaiah 40. So the tenor soloist sets the mood as he sings, comfort ye, my people, saith your God. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem, and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned. Folks, chapter 40 in Isaiah, it begins a major transition in this book, because Isaiah is no longer addressing Judah in his own day. He's being projected by the Holy Spirit out into the future, much like the Apostle John in the book of Revelation. He's looking in his prophetic crystal ball, and he's seeing a future day, and he's declaring the gospel to the Jews who are languishing there in Babylonian exile. And he's saying to them, and he's saying to all people who find themselves in some kind of an exile, dear ones, God has not abandoned you. Your best days are still ahead. God has a purpose of grace for you that's better than you can begin to imagine. He's coming to save you. So believe it and let this hope fill your souls. And folks, that was the good news for Isaiah's people, who at that time were feeling God forsaken. And yet God had not forsaken them, Isaiah tells them. God had forgiven their sins. He had reclaimed them as his own people. And what good news that must have been for them, as it is for all of us who seek to be God's people. Argentine evangelist Luis Palau, he tells of a woman named Maria who confronted him one day. Seems she had made this appointment under some false pretenses. She said that she came for a job interview, but when she got there, she made her intent clear. She was the secretary for the Communist Party in Ecuador. And so she denounced everything having to do with God, having to do with Jesus Christ. But Palau, he listened respectfully to her, and he replied gently to everything that she said. And this patient love and this concern that he showed, it slowly began to transform her. And she calmed down and she began to share her life story. And it was this tale of pain and suffering and sin. And she ended with one question. So supposing there is a God, would he ever accept a woman like me? And at that, Palau did not hesitate, but he turned in his Bible to Hebrews 10:17, and he read aloud these words to Maria. Their sins and their lawless acts I will remember no more. And immediately, Maria began to explain once again all the sins that she had committed, and immediately again, Palau, he read Hebrews 10:17, their sins and lawless acts I will remember no more. And folks, no less than 17 times, Maria tried to explain why she was unworthy to receive forgiveness, and 17 times Palau repeated those same words. Their sins and lawless acts I will remember no more. Until finally, Maria, the secretary to the Communist Party in Ecuador, bowed her head and she gave her life to Jesus Christ. Maria was comforted by the words from Hebrews, just as those exiles were comforted by Isaiah's words. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sins have been paid for. And of course, this joyous message, it's not just for Maria, it's not just for Israel, it's for all of us who have fallen short of the glory of God. You know, one of my favorite Christian authors is a guy by the name of Leith Anderson. And he tells about his teen years. And his dad had bought this mint new red Chevy convertible. Meanwhile, Leith had this humble little VW Bug. And one day his dad, he let Leith drive his new red Chevy convertible to a friend's house. And Leith decided to take the back way down this narrow, twisting mountain road. The speed limit was 45, and a buddy of his said, it's impossible to go 45 or around the curves, but Leith thought, I could go 45, and guess what? He was wrong. Because he went around one bend, he went outside the yellow lines, and there was another car, and they met, and he took out the whole driver's side on each of the cars, headlight to taillight. So the police came, and Leith called home, and his dad came immediately in the VW Bug, and he told Leith to go to his friend's house in the VW, and he would take care of the police in the car. And, of course, get ready for the big punchline here, because we've all been there, right? And maybe we haven't taken out our dad's new convertible, but all of us have sinned. All of us have needed forgiveness. In fact, I'm sure that there's more of a few of us here today for whom the greatest comfort that I could give you is to utter these three words: you are forgiven. Dear ones, these are God's words to us this morning, that regardless of your past, you are forgiven. And yet, let's not forget that God didn't forgive Israel because they deserved to be forgiven or because he regarded their offenses lightly. No, God forgave them simply because he loved them. And just like with Leith's dad, he was probably quite attached to his red convertible. I'm sure God was quite attached to his son. There was probably a part of Leith's dad that wanted to give his boy the thrashing of his life, and yet what would that gain? Because he knew his son felt bad enough as it was, and besides he knew that at that moment his son's greatest need was to be reassured of his father's love. And when any of us as parents, we share that kind of a love, we're reflecting the very image of God the Father. And who knows, perhaps maybe that's why we give gifts at Christmas, because they're a material way of reflecting God's love. Come down at Bethlehem. Let's finish with one last story. A woman named Rachel Raymond. She's a clinical professor of family and community medicine, Nate. And like Leith, she tells of an event that happened when she was a teenager that literally changed her life. She was 13. In that winter that she turned 13, her family declared bankruptcy. And it was a devastating thing to happen right before Christmas. And the result was that her family that year had to make all of their Christmas gifts rather than to buy them at the store. So Rachel, she knit this colorful muffler for her dad, and she took wire and she made a bracelet for her mom. And in spite of all of the financial difficulty, she says that the morning of Christmas, it was just as lively as it had always been. The presents, though they were homemade, were just as festive as ever. In fact, young Rachel ran her eyes over the pile of gifts that morning. She noticed that among them there lay this small velvet box, and she knew that a box like that didn't likely contain something homemade. And so she looked at it with suspicion, and while she looked and wondered what it could be, she heard her father say to her, "Open it, Rach. It's your Christmas present." So she unwrapped it, and she found in this small box a pair of 24-karat gold earrings. And to say that she was surprised is an understatement. And her dad said, "Come on, put them on. They're yours." And so she ran to the bathroom and she closed the door and she put them on, and then cautiously she looked into the mirror, and then something sad happened, because all Rachel could see was how ridiculous those expensive earrings looked on her homely teenaged face. And so with tears running down her cheeks, she ran back out of the bathroom to where she left her father, and she said, "How could you do this? Take them back. They look so stupid. I'm too ugly to wear them. How could you waste so much money?" And she flung the earrings to the floor, and she burst into tears. And all of the meanwhile, her dad said nothing, and then he got up and he wrapped his big arms around her, and he said, "Honey, I know they don't look right now, but I bought them because someday they're going to suit you perfectly." And about that experience, she writes, "I'm truly grateful to have survived my adolescence, because at some of my lowest moments, I'd get out that box and I would look at those earrings, and it seemed my father had spent $100 he didn't have because he believed in the person I was becoming. It was something to hold on to." Rachel found comfort in those earrings because they symbolized her father's love for her. And friends, isn't that what the meaning of Christmas is all about? For God so loved the world that he gave. Yeah, Christ came not because we deserve it or because he approves of everything that we have done or that we are. He came because of his Father's great love for us. And so, folks, I want you to take a few moments this Christmas to listen again to the opening lines of Handel's Messiah. I want you to listen as the tenor sets the mood in the opening words. Comfort ye, my people, saith your God. Speak comfortably to Jerusalem, and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned." And then listen as he sings the voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, "Prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." And then listen as he moves into a brief aria. "Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill made low, the crooked straight and the rough places smooth." And then listen as the entire choir breaks forth in a glorious refrain. "And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. What good news to all who need forgiveness. People like you and me. People like those you and I might run into over this Christmas season, who because of a touch from you might experience God's forgiveness for the first time. Saugatuck, or your next door neighbor. May they know the comforting touch of the Father's love through you as you share with them the gift of the Messiah. Let us pray. Bring comfort to us during this season, Father, and help us as you live inside of us to bring comfort and the forgiveness of the Christ child to those that we might encounter in the days ahead. We pray this in Jesus' name.